TDS, all that. The other laws I mentioned are required in residential 1 to 4. This law is only required residential 1 to 4 in a high or very high fire zone. So it's triggered by that, okay? So I'm going to try to share my screen and pull up the form. Can you see the form? Or did that work?
No.
Yeah, I had a problem this morning too. Marta, can you possibly pull up the form?
Can you see it?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Sorry I couldn't do it. But anyway, this is what we're talking about today. Okay. So listing agents, what do I need to know about this? Well, listing agents, you now have a new checklist you didn't have before. By the way, first thing first, the fire hardening part of this law has been in effect since January 1st. The defensible space part of this law has been in effect since July 1st. So what does that mean? Well, for the first 6 months of the year, there was a different form. It was the HHDA, the Home Fire Hardening Disclosure and Advisory. So for the first 6 months of the year, you should have been using that form, but that form is now gone. But the law isn't gone. That form is now the first 3 paragraphs of this form. So that form has been replaced. This new form incorporates the fire hardening stuff. And then it added the defensible space part. So the first 3 paragraphs that we're looking at right here are the fire hardening part. The 4th paragraph is a completely different law, but they're both sort of related to fires, so they're grouped together on the same form. Okay? So, listing agent, first you have to try to figure out, do I even need this form? So the first question you of course have to ask yourself is my listing in a high or very high fire hazard zone? If you live in California, there's 4 possibilities. Number 1, you're not in a fire zone. Number 2, you're in a moderate fire zone. Number 3, you're in a high. Number 4, you're in a very high. This form is only required in the last 2, high or very high. So I take a listing on residential 1 to 4. I got to figure out right away if I'm in a high or very high. How do I do that? Well, you have an NHD report because they're required every single deal, commercial, residential, land, there's no exception. NHD always required. So you get your NHD report, and the NHD report tells you right on the main page, there are 2 fire zones. One says very high fire zone, the other says wildland fire zone. If neither box is checked, you're not in a fire zone, you don't need this form. If the very high box is checked, you know from what I just told you, the form is definitely required. But what if the very high box is not checked, but the wildland fire box is checked? What is that telling you? That's telling you you're either in a high or a moderate. You're not in nothing, you're not in a very high, you're in high or moderate. But Gov, you just got through telling me this form is only required if I'm in a high, not a moderate. So how do I find out if I'm in a high or a moderate?
Yes.
You just push your NHD company a little harder and say, please tell me.
Is there any way we can do 1030?
Someone's need to mute themselves. Okay. Anyway, so the point is, how do I find out if I'm actually in a high? You can try to figure it out yourself. We have a Q&A that shows you how to try to do it, but I would just always go to the NHD company. They can tell you, they will tell you, they want to tell you. Having said that, some people, of course, want to provide this form, whether if you're in any type of fire zone, which is why in paragraph 2 there, you can actually check the box in B and provide the form, even though you're not in a high or very high. Now, would I recommend that? I'm not sure I recommend it either way. I think the only confusing thing about providing this form, even though you're not in a high or very high, is that none of the things that you have to do that this form is going to tell you about, do you actually have to do? In other words, if you're providing it to a buyer in a moderate or a no zone at all, you're providing it purely as a disclosure of general information. So you're telling them, read paragraph 1, and Marta, if you can scroll down a little bit, and read paragraph 3A, but I'm not going to fill in the answers to 3B. Right? So in other words, and I'm not going to check any of the boxes in paragraph 4. So the requirement to check the boxes in B and the requirement to check one of the boxes in 4 is only triggered by the fact that you're in a high or a very high. So if you want to just provide the form anyway, even though you're not in a high or very high, by checking that box in 2B, I think you should also make clear to the buyer that my seller is just not answering those questions in B. We're not saying that none of those apply. We're just saying, since we don't have to, we're not going to answer. You see what I'm saying? Let me say it another way. If you're in a high or very high and the house is built before 2010, the seller is required to read 3B and check any of the boxes that are relevant. On the other hand, if you're providing the form, even though you're not in a high or very high, the seller doesn't have to check those boxes. But the buyer might be confused. It's like, are you not checking those boxes because none of them are relevant? Or are you not checking those boxes because you don't have to check them, even if they are relevant? That's why I don't like the idea of providing the form unless you're actually in a high or very high. But obviously that was contemplated, because look at the form. But the form itself in paragraph 2 gives you the option of providing the form even though it's not in the high or very high. I just think if you're doing that, you better also explain to the buyer why you're not checking the boxes in B. Or maybe you're going to provide the form and check the boxes anyway. So there are various ways you can go with that. But anyway, and the other thing, you heard me say it quick, I'll say it again. So the first thing that a listing agent does, you figure out if you're in a high or very high to see if the form is even required. Janet, that's about what I'm going to clarify right now. Thank you for asking. So on my listing agent checklist, the first thing I ask myself, am I in a high or very high? If the answer is yes, the form is definitely required. But then I got to ask myself the second question. Is the property built before or after 2010? If the house is built after 2010, the form is required, but the seller doesn't have to check any of the boxes in paragraph 3B. But paragraph 4 is still relevant. To put that another way, the defensible space part of this law is required on all sales in a high or very high. The fire hardening part is only required on sales in a high or very high if the property was built before 2010. I'll tell you why that is. Anything built after 2010 in a high or very high zone was built under the new fire building code. And it's not allowed to have a wood roof. It has to have dual pane windows. It has to have roof flashing. It has to have rain gutters with non-combustible gutter covers. So if you're selling a house built after 2010, none of those check boxes are going to be relevant anyway, because the house was built with all that stuff, without that stuff. But if the house was built before 2010, it may still have a wood roof. It may not have dual pane windows. So you got to tell the buyer, hey buyer, even though this house you're buying is in a high or very high fire zone, so it's at risk of fires, I have to tell you, my house still has some things that aren't recommended in houses that are in those areas. Buyer says, really? You still have a wood roof? Then I want you to change the roof. The seller can say, well, no. In other words, the seller doesn't have to do anything. They've got to disclose their house, but they don't have to upgrade anything. It's not a retrofit at all. It's pure disclosure. Buyer doesn't like it, don't buy the house. Or I guess they could put a request for repair asking the seller to put on a new roof. It's up to the seller. But it's pure disclosure. The fire hardening part of this law is pure disclosure. So as a listing agent, you got to figure out, right? If it's in a high zone, and you also got to figure out what type of, when it was built. Okay. And that's it. That's all I really have to say on fire hardening. The fire hardening part is pretty simple. Now, before I go any further, Angelica asking me, is there a central database to check what zone you're in? Because you found that certain different NHD companies contradict each other. Well, that's a problem. That is a problem. If that happens, one of the NHD companies is probably right and one of them is wrong. But you know what else might be happening, which I've noticed? And that is some areas, I don't know about your area, have local fire zones. They may have a local high fire zone, which is not part of a state high or very high fire zone. And maybe the NHD company is, or maybe they're confused, or maybe they're telling you, yes, this property is in a very high fire zone, but they're saying they're in a local high fire zone rather than the state one. The only thing that triggers this law, by the way, is if you're in a state high or very high. So if you're not in a state high or very high, this form is not required, even though the NHD company has told you accurately that it's in a local zone. That might be what's happening. The suggestion to check with an insurance broker is probably a good idea because the insurance brokers, they want to know, they definitely take into consideration what type of fire zone you're in, and they probably will be able to tell you. And like I said, we also have a Q&A on this that shows you how you can, if you want to take the responsibility yourself to do this, you can do it too. It tells you what maps to look at. But my experience with NHD companies is most of the ones I talk to are pretty good about being able to tell me if I'm in a state very high or a state high fire hazard zone. Okay, that's my experience. But maybe you're not having the same luck in your area with NHD companies. I'm sorry about that. Now, what about a central database? Are we going to have that? I'm not sure. I think that'd be an incredibly helpful thing, but I also think these maps change constantly, and I'm not sure how helpful that would be. It's the reason you're paying the NHD company is because they are guaranteeing and standing behind their report, telling you at this moment if the property's in a high zone or a very high zone or not. Okay. All right. State absolutely prevails. In other words, the way I didn't answer that, Anita, is this, the state is what triggers this law. The state, it's not that the state supersedes the local stuff is very important, but this law and this form is triggered by state zones, is what I'm saying. And Gerald, you're right, I'm about to get into this. So this disclosure, as I said, it's sort of the sixth big disclosure. It's not simply a disclosure, it's also an addendum. Because as I'm about to explain to you, this form, you're not just disclosing information to the buyer. That is what you're doing in paragraph 1, 2, and 3. But in paragraph 4, which we're about to talk about, you're not just providing information to the buyer, you're getting the buyer to agree to do something. So let's take a step back. Okay, I'm the listing agent. And now I'm up to paragraph, I've taken care of paragraph 3. I've determined, first I've determined that the form is required. And based on how old the house is, I've determined whether my seller needs to answer those questions in 3B. So now, listing agent, we're up to paragraph 4. Now your job is to figure out which paragraph, which subparagraph in 4B is relevant. So Marta, if you can please just scroll it down a little bit more so we can see all of paragraph 4.
The sample thing would be on there.
Perfect. All right, we're all looking at paragraph 4 now. Listing agent, it is your job to figure out what is relevant as to 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the funny thing, you know, I hate to tell you this, you're looking at the version of the form that's on zip form, but they're putting out a new version on zip form, which is almost identical, except paragraph 2 and 3 are going to be reversed. I don't know why, but anyway, but here's the deal, listing agent. You get to this point, how do I figure out how to fill out 4B? All you got to do is figure out, is there a where I have my listing in that county, in that city, is there a local ordinance regarding defensible space that requires the seller or the buyer to do something? Now we have learned, I was just giving a talk right before this one to North Bay, and for example, Sonoma, Mendocino, Napa, they all have local defensible space ordinances, but none of them require you to do anything at point of sale. I mean, bottom line, look at paragraph 4A. The first thing this form is telling you is there is already a state law in existence that requires you to have 100 feet of defensible space around your building if you're in a high or very high zone. That's true before this law ever happened. That's been true for a while. If you live in a high or very high, you're supposed to have 100 foot of defensible space. And if you don't, you're vulnerable. You've always been vulnerable to either CAL FIRE or a local fire company coming out to your house, doing an inspection, finding you in violation, and getting you in trouble. That was true long before this law. All this law is doing is saying, when you sell a house in a high or very high, either the buyer or the seller has this obligation to go out and get documentation of compliance. The properties are all supposed to be in compliance anyway. But this law is saying a sale is triggering an obligation to get documentation. Everyone should already be in compliance. Number one, it's the law. Number two, don't you want to be safe? But of course, there are people in high and very high fire zones who don't currently have 100 feet of defensible space. If someone says, what does that mean, defensible space? All you simply do is Google that Public Resources Code section. Google 4291, look it up. It will tell you what it means by what has to be in the 100-foot range and what has to be in the 30-foot range. Okay. So, but this law, this new law says, if you're selling a house, that triggers an obligation. And there are 4 possibilities. So listing agent, you have to figure out, is there a local ordinance first does Ventura County or wherever or the city where I'm in, some counties don't have them, but cities have them. Does the city or county where I'm selling this house have a local defensible space or vegetation management law? But even if it does that law require the seller or the buyer to do anything? It's been our experience, we have not found a single place in Southern California where there's a local ordinance requiring the seller or the buyer to do something at point of sale. But we don't know everything. We don't know every town in Ventura County. So you have to figure out, does the town or city where I'm selling the house require my seller or buyer to do anything because we're selling it? How do I even find that out? It's very easy. Call up your local fire company. Hey, is there, you guys being in real estate would probably already know this, but you can always call up your local fire company and say, hey, when you sell a house in this town, am I required to do anything? Is there a point of sale mandate I have to do? I think the answer is going to be no. Even as something like Big Bear, Big Bear has mandatory inspections every 6 months, but they're not triggered by a sale. They're just every 6 months. So you got to figure out, and I'm pretty sure the answer is no, is there a local ordinance in your city or county triggered by a sale that requires the seller or the buyer to do anything? There are a couple places like Truckee up north, Lake Tahoe. In Truckee, they're going to check box number 4 because there actually is an ordinance up there that requires the seller to do something point of sale. There are a couple of other towns we run into up north like that. And there also are a couple places that say there's a local ordinance that says, buyer, when you buy a house, you've got something like 2 months or something after close to make sure you're in compliance with the local law. Chances are on your listing in Ventura County, neither one of those things are true. So you're not going to check 3 or 4 on this form. Most of your sales are going to be, and most of the sales in the whole state of California are going to be B1 or B2. So once again, I'm talking to you as a listing agent. Number 1, you've determined that the form is required because it's in a very high or high. Number 2, you've determined how old the house is, which determines whether your seller has to check those boxes in paragraph 3. And the third thing you've just determined is there a local ordinance requiring someone to do something, to do an inspection or get documentation at point of sale? Chances are the answer to that is no. The fourth and final thing you have to ask yourself, listing agent, is relevant to paragraph 4B2. You have to ask your seller, hey seller, by any chance in the last 6 months, did either CAL FIRE or a local fire company come out to your house to check and see if you have the 100-foot of defensible space? Because remember, CAL FIRE or local companies have the right to do that anytime they want, if you're in a high or very high. So you're going to ask your seller, did any government fire company happen to come out here? Or did you ask them to come out? Did you volunteer? Did someone come out and inspect your property in the last 6 months and give you documentation of compliance? Seller says, yeah, as a matter of fact, a couple of months ago, they were out here. Then you say, great, do you have the piece of paper they gave you? Yeah, I sure do. Well, then let's check box number 2 and give it to the buyer and we're done. That might happen sometimes. But I suspect most of the time when you have a listing and you ask the buyer, if you're in Big Bear, the answer is going to be yes, because they come out every 6 months. But I suspect you're going to be the seller's probably going to say, nope, no one's been out here in the last 6 months. No, we've had no fire defensible space inspection in the last 6 months. Well, guess what? You've now figured out that this is a B1 transaction. You figured out 3 or 4 are not relevant because there's no local ordinance requiring me to do anything. And B2, you've asked the seller if they did a voluntary or there was any type of inspection the last 6 months. Nope. So now you know you're not going to check any of those 3 boxes, and it's a B1 transaction. And you're simply going to give this form to the buyer. You filled out paragraph 3 and you haven't checked any of the boxes in 4. What about paragraph 5 you're asking? I'll get to that in a second. But let me stick with 4 for now. So B1, look what that says. Buyer shall obtain documentation. There's no local ordinance for trying to prove compliance. Buyers shall obtain documentation within a year after close. This only applies if there's a state or local agency or other government entity in the jurisdiction. There are some places in California, believe it or not, where there's no fire company, but that's rare. So generally, there is a fire company. So what you're now giving this form to the buyer, and the buyer, you're not just giving them information now, but you're giving this form to the buyer. And by signing the form, the buyer is not just agreeing that when the buyer signs the TDS, what do they say? Yes, I've received the TDS. When they sign the lead paint form, what are they saying? Yes, I've received the form. When the buyer signs this form, they're not just saying, yes, I've received the form. They're saying, I agree with B1. I will obtain documentation of compliance within a year after close. So before we go any further, the buyer, of course, is going to wonder, what does that mean and how do I do it? Listing agent, is it your job to explain to the buyer what that means? Absolutely not. This is a mandatory form. It's not your job to explain the form to them. Buyer's agent, you have a fiduciary duty to your buyer to explain to them the things they're signing. So now, for the first time, I'm talking to you as a buyer's agent. What is my job regarding this law? Your job regarding this law is, if your buyer gets this form and none of those boxes 2, 3, or 4 aren't checked, your job is simply to explain to the buyer, you see what you've just agreed to here? You've agreed that you're going to obtain documentation of compliance within a year. Then they're going to say, how do I do that? And you're going to say, well, once escrow closes, what I recommend you do is you call up CAL FIRE and say, hey, CAL FIRE, I just bought a house. I'm in a very high zone. I'm supposed to call you up so you can come out and inspect it. CAL FIRE, if you're in a CAL FIRE area, they're going to say, yes, you're right. Thanks for calling. Let's arrange something. CAL FIRE is aware of this law and they're hiring a lot of inspectors. But CAL FIRE may say to you, no, sorry, we'd like to help, but your property is not, your listing is not in a CAL FIRE area. This property is not in a CAL FIRE area. If that's the case, then what the buyer should do is call the local fire company. Say, hey, local fire company, I just bought a house and I'm required to call you up and see if you can come out to give me documentation of compliance. You know what the reaction of the local company might be? Well, Jim Keith is just telling me Ventura County will do it. Thanks, Jim. Some local companies we found around the state just simply won't do it. You'll call them and they say, no, we don't do that. We don't have the resources for that. Maybe we respond to complaints. Maybe we randomly inspect, but we don't just upon request inspect. So what do I do if I'm a buyer and that happens? Which probably won't be the case based on what Jim just told me. Probably Ventura will do it. But if you were for some reason in an area where you called the local company and they said, no, we don't do that, then you know what, buyer, you're done. You tried. You're not in a CAL FIRE area. You're in a local area, but they won't come out. You'd write down on a piece of paper, talk to Jim Jones, John Smith at the blah, blah, blah. They said they're not coming. Boom. You're done. On the other hand, it seems to be probably in Ventura County, they will come out. Okay? Which leads to a couple of more questions. Buyer may say to you, can I take care of this before escrow closes? The problem with that is, as you probably know, the purchase contract says in paragraph 12, and it's also going to say it in the new form, buyer cannot do any government inspection during escrow without the seller's permission. And if I were the seller in escrow and the buyer said, hey, can I have the fire company come out during escrow? I'd probably say, nah, wait till after close. I mean, if the seller wants to allow it, they can. But in other words, buyer, you don't have the right without the seller's permission in advance to call up a fire company before close of escrow. So that's one issue. The next issue is, what if your buyer, what if they get this form and the buyer says, really? That's what I have to do? I don't want to do it. So I ain't signing this form. I refuse to sign this form because it's a B1. I don't like B1. I refuse to agree to do this. Do they have the right to do that? I mean, I'll tell you what, the law says they got to do it whether they sign the form or not. But the question is, if I'm a seller selling to a buyer who refuses to sign the form, so they refuse to commit themselves to do this, are there any possible negative repercussions against me, the seller, for closing a deal with a buyer who refused to agree to do what they're supposed to do? In other words, is that going to mean CAL FIRE or the local fire company can come back after me, the seller, and saying, well, we're going to make you take care of this because you closed the deal without getting the buyer to agree to do it? The answer is, at this point, we don't know. I think it's very unlikely that the seller would have any negative repercussions, but I can't guarantee it. And as you all know, if you know me, when I don't know the answer or when the answer is not clear, we give conservative advice. So I'd probably say to a seller, buyer won't sign it. How confident, seller, are you that the property is in compliance with defensible space? Well, I'm not that confident. Then maybe you don't want to sell to this buyer. Maybe you sell to the next buyer. Find a buyer who's willing to sign this. I mean, hopefully the seller says, yeah, oh, I know, well, we're definitely in compliance with 100. Yeah, I'm sure we're in compliance. In that case, there really wouldn't be much of a risk selling it to a buyer who refuses to sign the form because the property's in compliance. But even then, you have every right as a seller. If the buyer won't sign and return this form in 17 days, you have every right to give them a notice to buyer to perform. If they won't do it, you can cancel it. You can refuse to sell to a buyer who won't sign this form. I don't know if you guys have been running into that at all or not. I don't know. But that's the way to look at it, okay? Now, another question, wondering, what if the buyer does sign the form, but then over the next year, they don't do what they promised to do? They don't reach out to try to get documentation. Well, obviously, they've violated the law and they've violated the addendum that they just signed. Do you care as a seller? You don't care at all. Obviously, I hope it's obvious, seller, listing agent, buyer's agent, none of you have any obligation after close to make sure the buyer does what they just promised to do. You have no obligation. So let's say the buyer does close the deal, they sign the form agreeing they're going to do this, but then they just don't do it. Is CAL FIRE or Ventura County Fire going to actually maintain a database and keep track of all escrows that close? And a year from now, they say, oh, 123 Elm Street, they never called us, let's go get them. My gut reaction, they're not going to do that. They're really not. And let's say they do it. Let's say CAL FIRE says, oh, 123 Elm Street, they're in a CAL FIRE area. They closed a year ago because we keep track of these closed escrows. They never called us. Let's go out and get them. So they go out to the property and they figure out, guess what? The buyer is in compliance with defensible space. Are they going to punish the buyer even though they're in compliance because the buyer didn't reach out to them like they were supposed to within a year after close? I asked CAL FIRE that very question. They said, I don't know. No answer. So my job as a lawyer, though, I have to tell you what the law is, and I always recommend you follow the law. So if I were talking to a buyer, I would say, yeah, you probably should, within the next year, call up CAL FIRE or Ventura County Fire and get an inspection and get the documentation. By the way, my experience is if they do come out and you find you're not in compliance, they're not going to fine you. They're going to give you a certain amount of days to bring it into compliance. But what if they come out and tell you, oh, you got to cut down like 3 trees? And that's going to cost you thousands of dollars. Not good, right? How do I avoid that from happening? Maybe what buyers should do now is, before you remove your contingencies, try to figure out if you're in compliance with defensible space. It may be obvious. Maybe you're going to look at that Public Resources Code section. It's going to tell you, it tells you right in there. It says the trees have to be this distance and the grass has to be this inches. It tells you. And you basically look, I said, yeah, we're good. I can tell we're good. But maybe you're not 100% clear. Maybe it's worth your interest as a buyer, just like you might want to do a home inspection and a termite inspection. Maybe you want to hire some private defensible space inspector to come out and give you a private opinion whether you're okay or what you need to do to be in compliance, and do that before you can close escrow. Or if you've already closed, do that before you call CAL FIRE out there to see, to look at. I'm just thinking. That's just something to think about. I think the real purpose of this law is education. I mean, perhaps there are buyers out there who don't even know, have never heard of this concept of defensible space. Anita, I don't know. That's a very good, I've heard in some areas there are already people out there calling themselves, I can come out and do a defensible space inspection. As you know, no inspectors don't need to be licensed anyway. You or me can call ourselves a defensible space inspector if we want to. And if people trust us, and if we give them any type of warranty, who knows? We'll stand behind it. But I'm just thinking, and I've already heard it starting to happen. Maybe I'm buying a house in a higher, very high fire area. Before I actually commit to the deal, maybe I want to know how much it's going to cost to bring me into defensible space compliance. Something to think about, right? So that's an issue. Let me just see if there are more questions. Angelica, okay. The form is always required in a high or very high. So the form is required. The issue of CAL FIRE area or not CAL FIRE area is, who does the buyer call within a year after close to get the documentation of compliance? So the thing that triggers the form is very simple. Are you in a state very high or state high fire hazard severity zone? That triggers the form, and that triggers paragraph 4. Paragraph 3 is triggered by high or very high and built before 2010. But any sale in a high or very high triggers the form, triggers paragraph 4, and the listing agent has to either check one of the 3 boxes or it defaults to B1. So that's definitely the case. Janet, no, we have not aware of any state enforcement actions at all. But this is pretty new. And we're trying to keep very, very close watch on that. But I haven't told you one bad thing. Everything I've told you might be confusing, but you can probably deal with it. But here's the sort of confusing thing that we're dealing with right now that we're trying to fix. Everything I just told you, I will stand behind 1,000%. I think this meeting is being recorded. I'm recorded. I have absolutely no doubt on everything I've said, definitely. Here's a slight little glitch here. CAL FIRE has on their website, it says, this law, this new law triggers an obligation that sellers are required to do a defensible space inspection before close of escrow. Let me say this very clearly. That is false. That is not true. We've been talking to CAL FIRE, trying to get them to change their website. But I'm telling you right now, it's not true. The only thing that would require a seller to do an inspection prior to close of escrow would be a local ordinance requiring that. And we haven't found any of those yet in Southern California. What this law does do is it requires the buyer to do something. Having said that, let's think about this for a second. Even though CAL FIRE is not correct when they say that, CAL FIRE, before this law ever happened, has the right to come out to your house anyway, anytime they want, to make sure you're in compliance. So even if we think CAL FIRE is wrong in that statement, their new modus operandi might be, we're going to keep track of closed escrow. We're going to hire a realtor who has MLS access, keep track of listed properties. And when we see a listed property, we're going to go out to them and inspect them. They could do that. They could make their incorrect statement a reality. You know what I'm saying? Do you see what I'm saying there? CAL FIRE, and by the way, like I'm saying, everyone should be in compliance right now. Sellers, you should want to be in compliance right before you even sell it. While you're selling it, you should want to be in compliance. Because number one, it's the law. And number two, don't you want to be safe? This shouldn't be causing a big issue because people should already be wanting to. Now, if this law is telling people who didn't even know about defensible space, that's a good thing, because at least everyone starts to know about it. We need to try to be safe here. So anyway, that's my thought there. Jim, you're right. And the reason we've held off is we're still trying to get them to fix it. But if that doesn't happen quite soon, we are going to have to put something out saying, you know, CAL FIRE is saying something on the website that's not true. But the other thing to think about is, you know, you have to think about all sorts of things. CAL FIRE may say, oh yeah, you want to say that? Then we're really going to start going inspecting every house in escrow, which they would have the right to do. So them saying that doesn't mean they're going to enforce it. And they don't have the right to enforce it. In other words, even if they say on their website, seller is required to do an inspection, if the seller doesn't, CAL FIRE can't do anything to that seller because the law doesn't back them up. So I'm not sure how much we really care, but you're right. You don't want people to be confused. And I don't want every one of you thinking I got to rush out and do a defensible space inspection before we close, because you don't have to. It's a sticky situation. So we're trying to resolve it. And as I said, ultimately, it doesn't maybe matter what they say on their website. They could become very aggressive in state responsibility areas and just start doing a lot more random inspections. You never know. Okay. we got to resolve this quick. You're right, though. That one issue needs to be resolved. In other words, we either have to put something out to the members who aren't on this call hearing me say this, or what? Tim Hall, very good question. Obviously, you're only responsible for your own property. And what if, you don't have 100 foot of space around your property? Go out 100 foot, you're next door. So your neighbor doesn't happen to be in compliance. Well, that's really got nothing to do with this law. In other words, when buyer agrees in B1 to get documentation of compliance, that means documentation that your property is in compliance. By the way, you know what I would do if I had a neighbor not in compliance who's endangering me? That's exactly who I'd call up on call CAL FIRE on. CAL FIRE wants to know, and the local fire companies probably want to know too, who's clearly not in compliance. I mean, they do respond to complaints. So yeah, tell them about their neighbor, but it doesn't change the obligation of the property owner. You're only required to deal with your own property, right? That's the only thing you have to do. To say what I keep saying over and over again, there's really nothing new here on defensible space. Everyone should have defensible space. The only thing new is there's a new law triggering, number one, a disclosure about this, which is good. We all agree that's got to be good. And number two, triggering an obligation that a sale is not only triggering a disclosure, but a sale is triggering an obligation to go out and get documentation. And 99% of the time, that obligation is going to be the buyer's obligation, and they have a year to do it. And if they don't do it, I don't know what's going to happen to them. There's no penalties in this law that says, what if I don't do it? But of course, if a government fire company comes out and you're not in compliance, long before this law happened, you could get in trouble for that. I personally think CAL FIRE and the local companies are going to be more concerned whether or not you're in compliance as to whether or not you reached out to them within a year after close. But who knows? That's an unknown. So that's all. I think that's about all I have to tell you on this. Let's see if there are any more questions. I don't think there are any. My friend Jim, you can always please start unmuting yourselves. I'm fine with that. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Gov, how are you?
Good.
Just a couple of things. I think, I hope you don't wait too long to address the CAL FIRE thing. I think it would be a good idea to add a question to the already in existence Q&A that addresses that. And when they change or whatever, you can take it out.
Right, right.
Because there are going to be people who are going to see that and say, well, this says, and it's CAL FIRE.
Right, right. You're right, you're right.
Second thing is, Ventura County Fire Department does have a form online that where you can request a defensible space inspection. I'm not sure how geared up they are at this point, okay, but the form is online currently. Secondly, there is an organization, I think I told you about it a while ago, Gov, Ventura County Fire Safe Council. They're a 501c3. They are not doing defensible space inspections right now. I think they want to get geared up to do that. They rely on grants and so on and so forth. I think they're going to apply to the state. There's $100 million sitting there for stuff like this. But I had them out. They did a home hardening inspection on my home. If anybody has questions about something like that, again, they're just getting geared up right now because this thing is just starting. But they have done a few home hardening inspections. My home was built in 2000, so there weren't some of the issues that other people are going to have to deal with. But I wasn't sure about the gaps in my vents and stuff like that. They're a 1/4 inch, and I guess there's some aftermarket fixes you can do that are relatively inexpensive if you want to change out vents. The guy that did my inspection is a fire captain with an active fire captain with Ventura County, who's part of the Ventura County Fire Safe Council. And it's mainly retired fire chiefs and stuff like that. It's a good organization. I suggest everybody look into it.
Thanks, Jim. And by the way, they would be authorized. They're once they're geared up, they are considered an authorized inspector. So in other words, you can call them rather than CAL FIRE or the local company. Maybe the advantage with calling them is they might not fine you if you're in violation, unless they're going to refer you to CAL FIRE. Who knows? I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how that will work. Hey, Janet.
Hey, Gov, how are you doing?
Hey.
Good. I've listened to so many of these, as you know. So I haven't looked at the Q&A recently, but did you add in the consideration, the buyer considerations for the defensible space? Is that in the Q&A yet?
What do you mean by that, the buyer considerations?
Well, so the buyer consideration, when they're purchasing and they're considering.
Oh, I see what you're saying. No, we got to do that. Yeah, we got to real quick, and we're going to do it very quickly, deal with that issue and also the CAL FIRE issue too. We were just hoping to get CAL FIRE to come around, but you're right. Maybe this week or so is probably, we got to just sort of do it. But you're right. We also need to put in there something about maybe a stronger recommendation that, hey, buyer, maybe this is something you should think about in the pre-contingency removal time. By the way, are most of your deals non-contingent deals, or do you have contingent deals?
We advise against it, but it's being done. I don't know about everybody else.
I haven't checked recently, but when the market was, maybe it's not quite as hot as it was, but some places, that's all we heard about. Every offer was non-contingent.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, there's a lot of that going on.
So buyers wouldn't even have the opportunity to check this out. Vivian, yeah, thank you. I mean, in other words, it's probably a good tip then for buyers. One of the inspections they should think about doing, perhaps, and this is another thing, gets back to the organization Jim was saying. When I say do an inspection, you're not, as you probably know, the purchase contract says you can't do a government inspection during escrow without seller's permission. So we're talking about a buyer hiring some private entity or this council, not a government entity. And I think I'd want to do that anyway. I want some private person to come out and tell me what it looks like before I call the government out, who has the power to fine me for not being in compliance. But the point is, you cannot, without the seller's permission in escrow before you've bought it, call out a government inspection such as a CAL FIRE or Ventura County fire. So not that I don't think you'd really want to anyway. I'd rather probably want to check it out myself anyway. So I figured I want to know what am I buying here? I mean, how many trees am I going to have to cut down here, if any? This could cost a lot of money. Could be. So
I had one other just general comment, just based on experience and having dealt with this now for a good portion of Southern California. There are some fire agencies that when you call, if you're the seller and you're looking to find out if there's a local ordinance that requires documentation of compliance, and I think it's really important if you're advising your sellers to make that phone call that you're including that very specific phrase, that documentation of compliance, because a local fire agency is very motivated by money, and they will tell you, oh yes, you need to have an inspection, and they'll schedule an inspection for the seller, even though the seller may not need to have documentation of compliance by close of escrow. And that's happened several times, and those inspections can be a couple of $100s, and it doesn't do anything for the seller in furthering the escrow. So it's really important that that phrase is included, documentation of compliance, as a result of closing escrow. So I just wanted to put that out there because we had several of those happen in SoCal.
that's a great tip. Yeah. Another thing we should put in our Q&A. Because you're right. It's not that, is there a local ordinance? Is there a local ordinance that requires documentation of compliance? And that's the thing we're finding very rare, very rare.
I have, for this group, I have a cheat sheet that I give agents that just says from a seller's perspective what they need to do. I'm happy to share that maybe Marta, I can send that to you and you can send it out to everybody. It's a really easy, sort of decision tree. It's a one pager, really simple. I find it helps me when I'm thinking about talking about it with agents, and the agents I'm sharing it with love it. So yes, Marta. Okay.
And I think, Jim, someone also asked you for the name of that organization.
Ventura County Fire Safe Council.
Jim is too lazy to type that into the chat, so. Right, Jim?
I'll show your high school graduation picture if you're not careful.
Which he does have, by the way. Anyway, there it is. Thanks, Marta. And thanks, Jim, above all.
By the way, Gov, just out of curiosity, I can see this thing becoming point of sale eventually. I think it's going to. Has there been any talk about that? You have?
Not that we've heard, not that we've heard.
Okay.
You know what my take on this is, which I'm thinking this, and tell me if you've run into this. My thinking is insurance companies would be the ones pushing this. I would think that if I were an insurance company and I had someone buy a house in a very high fire zone, and they were coming to me asking for fire insurance, I'm wondering why the insurance company doesn't say, well, we're going to first demand that you have documentation that you are in compliance with defensible space before we give you fire insurance. I would think that regardless of this whole law, I'm amazed that that's not happening.
Gov, I think it kind of is starting to happen. I have heard there are insurance companies that are talking, and if somebody's home is fire hardened, if you make those kinds of little adjustments, in some cases minor adjustments, and you do have defensible space, I think I have heard there are a couple of insurance agents, a couple of insurance companies that are talking about possibly some adjustment in so far as rates are concerned.
Yeah. And someone told me once that they haven't still figured out exactly, because insurance companies do all these complications to see, well, what's the likelihood of this amount of compliance leading to this amount of damage?
Right.
Perhaps they haven't figured all that out yet, but I would think this is going to be something that's going to push it, because the problem with insurance. By the way, did you hear the good news? There was a court case supporting the fire commissioner's order that under the FAIR plan that insurance companies have to offer comprehensive insurance, not just fire only. So that might reduce the cost, hopefully, of fire insurance when people are required to go under the FAIR plan. So that's probably a good thing. See if there are any more questions.
Gov, it's Charlene Simone.
Hi, Charlene.
Hi. Don't you think most sellers are going to know if their home is in a defensible space area? Because typically here, I can speak for Simi Valley. Here, the fire department goes through certain areas each year and tells those homeowners that you have to cut your grass back or trim your trees or whatever, and you have X amount of time to do it, and then they come back and they check again. I'm a little concerned, and I know sometimes you feel this way too, that agents are going to take this upon themselves to do all this research for their clients. And it's starting to remind me a little bit of like Megan's Law, where all of a sudden agents were doing all the investigating, and then we had to say, put the brakes on, guys. You have to have, your sellers have to be able to make this disclosure, not necessarily you doing all the research. What are your thoughts there?
I totally agree with you. It's not something that agents should be doing. Absolutely not. Yeah. And by the way, your comment about you think, well, I mean, maybe in Simi, maybe in Big Bear, but I don't know if it's universal that fire companies regularly just come out.
Yeah, I saw
Right? I
Jim
mean-
throw his hands up in the air, so I'm guessing I'm wrong.
Because, I mean, there are some places perhaps where this happens, but I think but as I said, CAL FIRE has hired a whole bunch of people.
Mhm.
On the other hand, they don't have jurisdiction over everything. Maybe the local fire companies are gonna start doing more inspections, hiring more people. I don't know where they're gonna get the resources to do it, though. So, yeah, we'll see, I guess.
Okay, thank you. I can just sense it going in that direction, and I don't typically like agents to be doing all the investigating on behalf of their clients.
Yes. I agree 100% to that for sure. Absolutely. So everyone's going to take a class on the new purchase contract, right? People are asking me, how did it go from 10 pages to 16 pages? What the heck happened? And I'll tell you right now, it's not like there are new paragraphs. It's like every paragraph in there has been added to and improved. So the forms committee basically made a decision. Should we try to keep it as short as we can and still cover the minimum of what we need to, or should we put everything in there that everyone should be thinking about? And all the questions that, like the hotline question we've been getting the last 6 or 7 years that could have been answered by a further explanation in a form. So it's like, when you look at it, you'll see it's still, there's still paragraph 14. And there's almost, the paragraphs have been renumbered a little bit, but they're all pretty much there. But each one is sort of longer. And just the one fundamental difference in the form is, instead of all of the places throughout the form, you know, buyers, when they're writing an offer, at many places they have to make a decision, right? What's the deadline here? How much is this? And who's paying for this? Right now, those are scattered between, you know, paragraph 4 and paragraph 7 and paragraph 3 and paragraph 14. All of the places where a buyer has to make a decision, a deal point. Who's paying? What's the deadline? How much am I? All those are going to be in one paragraph. Now, the explanations for the elaboration on these issues are still going to be in the body of the form. But it'll be a lot harder to miss something. You know, right on the current form, it's probably, you can maybe miss a paragraph, miss a blank in a paragraph. Oops, we skipped that one. It's going to be impossible in the new form, because paragraph 3 is going to have every deal point right there. So you're just going to go, and my favorite thing is all the 8 contingencies are all going to be in one place. For the last 15 years teaching this form, I've had to tell people, yeah, there are contingencies in paragraphs 3, 4, 8, 10, 12, and 13. There are 8 different contingencies in like 7 different paragraphs. Whereas those paragraphs are still going to be there, but all 8 contingencies are going to be right next to each other. So you can easily look at them all. So I personally really like the form. The only negative is it's 16 pages. But everything in there, I think, is an improvement over the current form. So the people like you that are on this call are the ones who actually read all 16 pages, so you'll be happy. All the agents who aren't on this call are the ones who are going to want to read just paragraph 3 and say to their clients, read the rest of this, please. But hopefully that won't be happening. But I think you're going to like it. So I'm going to start teaching classes next week. There'll be plenty of them. Plus, we're going to have free webinars starting in October. And no need to take it right away because the form's not coming out till the end of December. But I would strongly advise, some of you I know are chomping at the bit, you're curious, so you want, whatever. We got plenty of classes and plenty of webinars. But I just wanted to give you a quick overview since I had a couple minutes. A bonus, giving you a bonus today. So seeing no more questions, Marta or anybody wants to say anything? Otherwise, I'm just gonna leave. I didn't get my lunch today. I did one of these right before this, so. I've been on Zoom since 11:30.
I feel your pain, Gov. I feel your pain. I'm in the
Yeah.
same place.
I know a lot of you guys, people like you, people in the positions you're in, you're on Zooms all day too. You know exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. Thank you for being here again. We really appreciate it. And thanks for letting us record it. So that way they can review it if need be, and that'll help keep the legal hotline free or freer possibly. So
Yeah,
thanks so much
Right.
for that, Gov. Really appreciate
my
your time.
pleasure. All right, guys, I'm maybe see some of you at the meetings, if that ever happens in Anaheim. The rest of you I hope to see next year.